Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. The Cuban Missile Crisis. That's what we're looking at today. I don't want to spend the entire length of the video simply describing what happened because there are tons of resources available for that. I'm more interested in the analytical side of it. What caused it? Who was at fault? Who came out of it looking better? What's the legacy of the crisis? Things like that. So let me give you a quick overview of what the Cuban Missile Crisis was in order for us to get to the juicier bits. The crisis was a diplomatic standoff between the USA and the USSR at the height of the Cold War. The standoff was with regard to the Russians placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Americans said, look, there is no way we can tolerate this. Cuba is not just an enemy state. Cuba is right next door. It's a boat ride away from Florida. We cannot tolerate the presence of nuclear weapons aimed at us right next door. On top of that, the Americans were also angry that they had warned the USSR even prior to this that they would not accept nuclear weapons being shipped by Russia to armed countries in the Latin and Central American regions. So they felt that the Soviets were deliberately escalating tensions. The USSR said, look, the purpose of this placement is simply defensive because the nation of Cuba is scared that you guys will invade them. Just a year before this, the Americans had tried to stage an invasion of Cuba using Cuban exiles known as the Bay of Pigs. So this is simply to make sure that something like that won't happen again. That's what the Russians said. And the Russians also said, look guys, you have nuclear weapons pointed right at us from Italy, from Turkey. So it's perfectly fair for us to do the same to you. The United States didn't accept this, and so they decided to blockade Cuba from the rest of the world, saying, look, you guys can't go in there to give them more nuclear weapons. And the Soviets said, well, this is an act of aggression. This is an act of war. If you think you can prevent nations from using international waters to sail to other nations, you're risking a nuclear war with us. So both sides were convinced that they were the right one, and neither was willing to budge. The crisis lasted either 13 days or a little over a month based on how you want to define the start and end of it. But it was ultimately resolved through diplomacy. That's what you need to know. The US agreed to never invade Cuba again and to remove the nuclear weapons in Turkey and possibly Italy. The Russians agreed to remove the nuclear missiles from Cuba, and this ended the crisis. So that's the factual overview. Let's get into the analysis. Who was responsible? Clearly, both sides were. We're talking about the Cold War after all. Some say the Americans were to blame because the Cubans had every right to defend themselves from American aggression, and it was true that the Bay of Pigs was a failed American attempt. They also point out that Russia was right in wanting some kind of neutralizer against the threat of American nuclear weapons in their own doorstep, Italy and Turkey, as I was saying. However, it can also be argued that the Americans did not place missiles in Turkey and Italy to deliberately escalate the situation into a confrontation, because Turkey and Italy were simply losers in the world wars. They had no direct rivalry at that time with the Russians. On the other hand, Cuba and the USA were clearly enemies since Castro overthrew the Batista government in 1958. The Russians knew exactly how the Americans would react, and they did it anyway. They knew the Americans would throw a tantrum and wouldn't accept the logic of, oh, you have nuclear weapons in our backyard, so we're going to put weapons in yours. They knew Kennedy would never accept this, and they did it anyway. So you can take your pick over whom to blame for the escalation. Who came out of it looking better? Here again, you could say that both managed to look strong in front of their own audiences. Kennedy and Khrushchev do have their dictators when it comes to, their detractors when it comes to historians, but for the most part, in their own countries, they were acclaimed as diplomatic heroes for having resolved this entire thing without coming to nuclear war. The Russians were like, look, who cares if we have to remove nuclear weapons from Cuba? We managed to get the Americans to take away the nuclear missiles aimed at us from Italy and Turkey, which we previously had no bargaining chip against. But now we've gotten rid of them. And conversely, the Americans were like, those were outdated old Jupiter missiles anyway, which could have never been used even if we had wanted to. So we won because we've now set an example, a precedent, that Russia can never nuclearize Latin and South America, which means our military domination in the North and South American continent, which is essentially a third of the world, will now go uncontested. So each of them had their own spin to make themselves look like the winner. It was discovered much later that we actually came a lot closer to nuclear war than anyone had thought previously, because there were Russian submarines that had no direct contact with the Soviet high command, and some of them were even under the impression that a nuclear war had already started. If any of them had fired, like some of them had wanted to, it would have triggered a nuclear apocalypse. I will do a video somewhere down the line on Vasily Arkhipov, the Russian vice admiral who prevented this from happening, but that's a totally new discussion. We don't have time to get into that here. The impact on the world was enormous. Within a few years, countries together they came under one roof to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which said that no country could now help another become a nuclear power. And by then, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council had nuclear weapons for themselves, so they could just use it as an instrument to prevent anyone else from joining their elite club. The Cuban Missile Crisis also proved at the time that the Cold War could be handled diplomatically. It led to a huge cooling off period called the détente, where for the next 15 years or so, the Americans and the Russians did not get into any major provocations of this nature, because they both knew how close they had come to the precipice. It was only later in 1979, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that the Cold War started heating up once again. And that was my 7-minute snapshot of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope you found it informative. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.